Jeff, at this point, it's really hard for me to remember when you weren't the lead pastor at Connexus Church. But just to put this conversation into context, will you remind us when you stepped into that role and a little bit about what that transition looked like between you and Carey?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been at Connexus 13 years. So in order to become the lead pastor, you just have to stay the longest. I'm the longest running
That's the only reason
member.
why I'm leading the Unstuck group.
That's right. You just got to outlast everybody. So you don't have to be qualified. You just have to, outlast everyone. But I've been the lead pastor for almost 6 years of those 13 years. Took the baton from Carey almost 6 years ago. And yeah, just celebrated 13 years at Connexus, 20 years of full-time ministry as of this year.
And yeah, give us a little bit about just kind of the process of transition. I know it's a little bit of an unusual situation because of Carey and what he does, but It just wasn't an overnight transition, was it?
Yeah, it wasn't an overnight transition. I spent about 3.5 years in student ministry. That's what I first came to do. That's my first passion in ministry. Did that for 3.5 years, then became the exec director, kind of Carey's right hand for another 3 years, and was completing a building project then. And Carey and the elders approached me and said, would you be willing to consider the lead pastor position at Connexus? And what happened was prayed about it, felt called to it, took the position, and was just really honored by that. And then Carey continued on in a teaching role up until the beginning of COVID. So at this point, about 18 months ago. And the idea was he would do that for about 3 to 4, up to 5 years with like a bit of a ramp down at the end. And the idea was actually that we would hire another communicator, but what happened was I felt more and more called to more regular communication. And so I ended up doing kind of the point communicator, and we've actually built a team over time, team of communicators over the last 18 months. So Carey had over the course, it was probably about maybe 12 months ago, 8 months ago, Carey kind of preached sort of for, not that he won't come in and preach from time to time for us, but kind of his final official series on staff with us at Connexus. And he's still a part of the church. Carey and I are friends. I was talking to him right before this podcast. We probably talk almost every day. So have a great relationship, still a part of our church. He and Tony have been just amazing to Leslie and I.
Yes, and we should explain Carey's wife name is Tony, so that's right. That's the reference there.
Different Tony.
That's right. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is a great story to share because this whole podcast series, we're focusing on new leaders and new roles, and it's been an interesting transition specifically for you, Jeff, because you were a part of the Connexus team. Then you stepped into this new leadership lead pastor role, but it wasn't just the title change, was it? I'm curious to hear what you found to be kind of the biggest changes as far as your responsibilities were concerned when you stepped into the lead pastor position.
Yeah, I mean, what I used to say when Carey and I were passing the baton, so to give you an idea on the timeline, I officially became the lead pastor for the staff on October 1st and publicly to the church on November 1st. So it went fairly quick that way. And it was a season where I used to say, I feel like I'm wearing my dad's suit, the big with all, your sleeves hanging off. And Carey was wearing a suit that was too small. He was trying to figure out how do I operate in a smaller suit. And I was trying to figure out how to operate in the big suit and kind of figure it all out. And I would say, I was already leading the staff. I'd already led, the operational finances side. I'd come up in the, kind of next gen ministry. So I knew kind of how all those things operated, but the big changes for me, one of them was just the vision casting piece, casting vision a lot more often, casting vision to a camera a lot more, and stepping into a position that previously someone had held, Carey, who is so gifted at being clear, hyper clear. And the biggest challenge was, how do I speak from my heart and be who I am? And at the same time, try to bring the level of clarity that people were used to. That was a really big challenge for me over time, because you want to sound like you don't want to start to sound like Carey. And so that was really, really important. And the other one would be donor relationships. So while I'd handled the finances, I'd had limited relationships with donors. And so fostering those relationships, communicating with them, investing in them, that was a really new facet for me, and trying to build those relationships. So those would be kind of two of the bigger changes around the kind of the leadership side.
Jeff, what I found personally in new leadership roles that I've taken on is, first you kind of understand the position in one way when you read the profile of the job, you see the job description, and then you get a little bit more clarity when you start the onboarding process and you actually start to step into those new responsibilities. But then somewhere along the way, there's a surprise that kind of catches you where you thought, oh goodness, I didn't realize that was part of the job. So I'm curious to hear from you. What was the biggest surprise for you? In other words, having been a pastor in a church, but not being in the lead pastor role, was there anything about that new role that you didn't fully grasp until you were actually in that position?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, there are a couple of surprises that caught me along the way. One was when I transitioned, a lot of people had said to Carey and I, you're going to have staff transition when you transition. And both Carey and I agreed that probably wasn't going to happen, because I was already leading the staff. I was already relationally connected. They were already on board with my leadership. But it was probably, I became the lead pastor publicly in November. I came back from Christmas in January, and I had two staff give me a heads up that they're moving off the staff team in January, and were giving me notice. And they were the people I'd worked with the longest and the most closely, and who I had the best relationship with. Huge surprise. And those people still attend our church, still volunteer at our church. But Carey's transition created an atmosphere of transition. And when that happened, it wasn't that these people weren't loyal to the mission, but they started to rethink what they were doing. It wasn't about me personally. So that was a big surprise. The staff team shrunk really, really quickly. And so it was a brand new foxhole experience to create new memories and to solidify my relationship with a new group of staff. But I think that the other big surprise was, I knew that there would be a weight to the position, but it was the day-to-day pressure. I called my wife one day and I said to her, I feel like I walk around this place emotionally naked. Like this is pushing out all my problems. Like whatever personal struggles I had just became more obvious, more evident. The stuff that I struggle with became more evident to me and the people around me, because the pressure was pushing it out. And so for me, it was going, okay, when it comes to my own leadership, I'm starting to see the cracks more and more and more, and having to deal with those one by one. That was definitely a big surprise to me. And I think the other shift is, in a role like that, when you're in an exec role, you're solving a lot of problems. And when you're in the lead pastor seat, your role is more to bring perspective first and solve the problem second.
Oh, that's good.
And I think when I was the exec director, I was the problem solver for Carey. Now you bring me a problem. What I need to do is put this in the context of the vision, put it in the context of the big picture, align you around the rest of the team, then help you solve the problem, versus, okay, let's solve the problem. I'm the exec director. That's my job. And so that was a big shift for me as well, asking more questions, giving less answers, still trying to grow in that area, and reminding people of the big picture when they feel overwhelmed by the problem in front of them.
Yeah, that's very good, Jeff. So related to this, and maybe what you just shared answers this question, but as I have stepped into new roles with new responsibilities, sometimes I have found that it's difficult for me to give up the things that were a part of my previous job that I kind of grew comfortable doing because I felt like I was good at them. But in order to go to this next level of leadership, I needed to hand that off to somebody else. So I'm curious to hear from you, what was the hardest responsibility for you to give up from your previous role? When you took on your new responsibilities as a lead pastor, what did you have to start delegating to others? And it was kind of hard for you to give that away.
Yeah. So when I stepped into an exec director position and stepped away from student ministry, back then I had already done the hard work of stepping away from that. Student ministry was my first love. And so, but when I became a lead pastor, it wasn't the responsibilities that were hard to step away from. It was the relationships. It was, oh, I'm no longer working shoulder to shoulder with that person. And I'm no longer having a one-on-one with this person. Other people are doing that now. And for me, ministry is all been about, it's just not just what you do, it's who you do it with. And for me, that's always been a passion and a strength of mine. And so I would say the hardest thing for me was stepping away from responsibilities, from relationships, and having someone else build the relationship with that key staff member and not being able to connect with them as often.
Yeah, I certainly get that. Yeah, that's a good reminder of what that needs to look like as we're transitioning into new leadership roles. Jeff, we often talk about kind of these 4 key roles that senior pastors can't delegate, and that includes spiritual leadership of the church, which of course primarily happens through the teaching that we do, leading the senior leadership team of the church, casting vision, and then being the primary champion of culture, not only within the team, the staff team, but also within the church as a whole. So I guess the first question is, now that you're in that lead pastor role, do you agree with that list? And if so, or if not, of those roles, which one has challenged you the most early on in your lead pastor role?
Yeah, so I would say on that one, if I were to disagree on one, it would be teaching. Spiritual leadership is, to me, is different than teaching. So I was clearly the leader of our church and not the primary teacher for a number of years. My friend Jeff Henderson had did the same thing when Andy Stanley was on screen most of the time, and he was providing spiritual leadership. And he and I have talked about that before.
Mm-hmm.
That you are able to provide spiritual leadership in other ways, not just as the primary communicator. So that would be the one kind of nuance I would put on that. But all the others, vision casting and creating culture, absolutely. But that was part of my journey, was figuring out, okay, how do I lead spiritually in vision cast when I don't have 40 minutes on Sunday morning? And finding the spots to do that was a whole journey in itself. I would say the most challenging has been leading the leadership team. I would say that's been the most challenging. We really wanted to move. Carey's a real startup guy, had started the church, original founder, and very much what you would call a constellation model, where most of the staff would report directly to him. And what we wanted to do was we needed to scale larger. We were launching another location. We were beginning a network of partner churches, and we needed to scale up at the senior leadership level position, which meant creating an executive leadership team. So I had a leadership team that all reported to me. And then all of a sudden there was an executive team between myself and that team. And I would say trying to figure out what that system looks like, trying to figure out, hey, who actually has relationship to who is reporting to who, how you manage projects, all of those things change. I think when you start scaling your leadership, you end up scaling your infrastructure in a brand new way. And I would say that was one of the biggest challenges that I ended up facing, trying to move to a place where there's an executive team making high quality decisions over a leadership team of people who just all reported directly to me.
Yeah, and that we have found is actually a critical transition for churches to make, and oftentimes it needs to happen between that first generation leader and the second generation leader. It's not uncommon for, at least in the church context, I don't know if this carries over to marketplace or not, Jeff, but in church context, what we find is that oftentimes that first generation leader, all the key leaders do report directly to that person. The challenge is, over time, if you don't transition to a tighter senior leadership team, that flat organization, it sounds crazy, but what we see end up happening is it actually creates more division within the team. And I don't know why that is, but maybe it's just because one person can only engage with a certain number of leaders. And as a result of that, it's impossible to keep a broad team fully integrated. But that's an important transition that we see. And oftentimes it is the second generation leader that has to take on that responsibility to walk the team through that transition.
And again, that means changing the way your relationships work with particular staff.
That's right.
And it creates the challenge of aligning that senior leadership team around culture. If you're bringing in people from outside, we did a little bit of that. And so what that does is it's getting them aligned with the culture, getting them aligned with the vision. When the person who reports to them, who used to be on your team, actually gets the culture better, and trying to align everybody along those lines with a brand new layer creates a new challenge.
So Jeff, there's a big transition happening in church world. I mean, the builder and boomer senior pastors are passing the baton to the Gen Xers and the millennials. So as this is happening, what encouragement would you give senior pastors who are stepping into this new lead role for the very first time?
I think the number one thing that I've learned, and I knew this at other levels, but what changed for me at the leadership level, it's your character that's going to be the real journey, not your competency. And I think at the beginning, you start with so much insecurity around your competency, but it's your character at the end of the day. Because what happens is when it comes to stepping into the leadership role, it ends up just bringing a megaphone to so much of your character issues. And so if you're trying to be a different leader, if you're trying to be John Mark Comer, or you're trying to be Andy Stanley, and you're trying to fake it till you make it, at a certain point that becomes obvious to people. The pressure of leadership will push that out. And so if you struggle to delegate now, when you become the lead pastor, that struggle will be standing next to the megaphone to you, and you will realize how big an issue that really is for you. And the important thing for longevity, in my mind, is to lean into those things. And as you do, you become more of who you are, who the leader Jesus has called you to be. And it's easier for you, I think it was for me, at that point, it's easier for me to follow the lead of Jesus in leading my church rather than following the lead of my predecessor. It's easier for me to lead out and take risks rather than worry about breaking what I've been given. And to me, it's the character piece at the end of it. It feels like it's all competency when you start, but the long game is the character side of who you are. And as you lean into that, it's hard work, but it will pay off on the other end.
That's so good, Jeff. Thank you for sharing that. Any final thoughts you want to share?
You know what? I just want to say to anybody who's in leadership these days, I mean, in the church world, what you're doing is really, really important. And if I'm talking to anybody today who feels like that's not true, I just want you to know it is true. That person who you interact with today, that phone call, that email, it is important. It's impacting somebody. Don't give up. Keep leaning into where God's called you to, and He really is going to use you where you're at.